inside. But one plane, a routine British patrol, saw the ships on fire and the tracers streaking through the night.
I was in touch with control, and told them what was happening. I said, there's something wrong. They said, keep away. It's an exercise. I said, it's not an exercise. Something really happened. They're in trouble. You know, they want some help.
Neville says he ignored his orders and attacked 3 of the E-boats from the air. His was the only Allied plane to fire at the Germans that night.
So it dived down. I had rockets. I hit the last one with a rocket, and they were firing at me still, and they were still firing when it blew up.
The British pilot was also among the first to come up against the wall of secrecy that was already going up around Exercise Tiger.
This is ABC News Nightline, brought to you by IBM.
Al Sickley of Illinois and Bill Hicks of Michigan did not know each other back then, but they do now. They both survived Exercise Tiger and the frigid waters of the English Channel in April 1944.
Over I go.
Today, they're heading back out to the scene of the disaster.
Okay.
They will lay a wreath and watch divers try to locate and film the wrecks of their LSTs. When one considers the experiences of the sailors and soldiers who took part in Exercise Tiger, what is striking is how inexperienced they were. Apart from the recent crossing that they had made from America to Britain, many of them had never been to sea before. Yet they found themselves in the middle of a crucial dress rehearsal for what would be the largest sea invasion the world had ever known. They were green, and when the torpedoes slammed into the LSTs that night, because of their lack of experience, all they had to draw on was a little bit of training and their instinct for survival. Al Sickley was just 19, fresh out of high school. He was asleep on LST 507 when the alarm went off.
I got up and I started getting dressed. I tried to get my buddy up, and he was from Monmouth, Illinois. And he was very slow and lethargic and moving, and I said, well, I got to get going up there, see what's going on. So when I went up I started up the ladder, and I got about halfway up the ladder when the torpedo hit.
He never saw his friend again. Bill Hicks was on a different ship, LST 531. He wrote a journal on what happened that night.
We had 2 torpedoes hit us, and also our ammunition in our ship all go off. We tried to fight the fire, but it capsized very fast. The 3rd explosion blew us off the ship.
The heat was so intense, and the explosions were like chain reactions from starting with the gasoline and the oil and the ammunition. The ship was like folding up in half, and there was no way of going from bow to stern. So when the order came to abandon ship, I wasted no time in immediately jumping in the water.
Many men died because they refused to jump. There was so much burning oil and gas on the water's surface, the men were looking into a sea of flames.
A mass of fire all around us as oil, and was spreading, causing fire, which burned hundreds of men to death.
More Americans died that night than died on Utah Beach on D-Day itself, but the scale of the disaster could have been much worse. The Germans did not realize the LST convoy was without destroyer cover. So, after firing their torpedoes, the German boats turned and ran. Standard E-boat operating procedure.
I mean, we could have hit all the LSTs. The Americans couldn't even contact the British forces. It sounds unbelievable, but that's how it was. It was pure luck for them that we didn't think of doing another round. Then the remaining LSTs would not have had a nice time.
Those who survived the fire then had to endure the cold, 50-degree waters for 8 hours.
Myself, I had to swim for it. We ran across the life raft, which was loaded up with soldiers and our sailors. There was no room for us on the raft, so we had to tie ourselves to the sides and swim along. Well, several men were dying from the exposure, and we had 15 men on there, and 9 of them died. The channel water was between 49 and 51. Boy, it was sure cold.
Eventually, Bill Hicks, wounded in the leg and paralyzed from the cold, was picked up by a British destroyer. He remembers the shot of brandy they gave him, how good it tasted.
They pulled into some port and sent to a field hospital for the further treatment. They were treated by our American nurses. Boy, that was nice to see an American girl again.
Almost 60 years later, the day the veterans are to return to the wrecks, the skies are clear. But the wind and tide make the water much rougher than it was on that night in 1944. Both Al and Bill get seasick.
And we're right over it.
2 hours out to sea, the captain announces they are over the LST.
Go!
And the divers hit the water.
Go!
The wrecks are 160 feet down, not that deep, but in the English Channel, strong currents make for murky waters. The currents and the relatively shallow depth of the wrecks means they are not as well preserved as ships that are thousands of feet down. One of the few identifiable pieces of equipment, a ladder, the kind Al Sickley would have climbed to make his escape. On their way back up, the divers run into problems. The currents are so strong and sudden, they sweep the men up to the surface prematurely. There's a real risk of the divers getting the bends.
Portland Coast Guard, Portland Coast Guard.
The boat's captain gets on the radio to warn the Coast Guard of a possible emergency.
I have 2 divers that have been diving to 53 meters and have missed 20 minutes of stops. Over.
Within minutes, a search and rescue helicopter is over the boat, dropping a man on board.
We've actually taken on board.
The divers manage to convince their would-be rescuer they'll be okay.
I'm quite happy 100% staying where I am.
That there's no need to medevac them to a recompression chamber on shore.
We'll go the other side.
Instead, it's Al Sickley who gets evacuated. He's been ill, and at his age, because of the risk of dehydration, they are taking no chances. This time around, there has been no problem with communications, no typing error. And so, 60 years later, Al Sickley is rescued from the English Channel for a second time. Three months after the disaster, Exercise Tiger claimed another casualty. The man in charge, Admiral Don Moon, took a gun to his head and killed himself. It was one of many ramifications of an exercise gone wrong. The disaster forced General Eisenhower to rethink his D-Day plans because among the hundreds missing were 10 officers who knew the details of the invasion. Eisenhower feared they might have fallen into enemy hands. The general dispatched a man to identify all of the bodies as they were recovered, and it was only after each and every one of those missing officers was accounted for that the decision was taken. The invasion would go ahead as planned. Everyone associated with Exercise Tiger was sworn to secrecy, threatened with the firing squad if they jeopardized the coming invasion by talking. The men understood that. What they don't understand is why Exercise Tiger wasn't really talked about after D-Day, or for years after the war. The story was published 2 months after the invasion, but not really publicized or released in detail until the 1970s, when it became declassified. 6 decades after Tiger, there are still traces of bitterness among survivors. Not so much about what went wrong that night. It has more to do with their place in history. They feel they don't really have one.
For every event that happened that was important, like D-Day and Pearl Harbor and Pork Chop, the Pork Chop Battle, Pork Chop Hill Battle, they have those marked on their calendar, those dates, but you don't see anything for April 28th. Exercise Tiger is not listed there. We have young men, 19, 20-year-old men that were out there and they sacrificed their lives. It's just something in history that's been forgotten for some reason. These boys didn't get the credit they deserved. That's what bothers me.
Despite the hundreds of lost lives, Tiger and a series of exercises before it did accomplish what they were supposed to. They exposed weaknesses in the naval alliance, some of which would be addressed in the 6 weeks leading up to the real invasion.
After Exercise Tiger, the Royal Navy and the United States Navy communicate better. They understand the risks. The complacency is greatly reduced. It kind of sharpens things up generally.
It sharpened procedures, corrected simple oversights, such as training on how to wear a life preserver. American sailors were well versed on that, but many of the soldiers, the GIs they were transporting on the night of Exercise Tiger, were not. Many men drowned just because they put the life belts around their waists instead of under their arms, making them top-heavy. American forces took the lessons learned on Exercise Tiger right to the coast of France, all the way to Omaha and Utah beaches. And when presidents and prime ministers paid tribute to the men who landed on June 6, 1944, without saying it, without knowing it, they'll also be saluting other men who made D-Day possible, such as the Americans who perished during Exercise Tiger, the men Al Sickley and Bill Hicks paid their respects to.